So what do you get when you mix new wave of British heavy metal with hardcore punk? You get thrash metal. Hey, welcome to the channel. My name is Jasper. So thrash metal is definitely one of my favorite genres in metal. It's one of those genres that I will always keep going back to no matter what my mood is, and a lot of my favorite bands in metal are part of the thrash family. When a lot of these bands came out, there was more than one heavy metal purist or critic that would say that this new music was just a bunch of noise. Worldwide, there were young bands taking the complexity of new wave of British heavy metal, but at the same time the intensity, the aggression of hardcore punk. But a key element would be bands that are now considered the very first wave of black metal, like Venom or Merciful Fate. Anyways, in the early 80s, there were bands all over the world that were taking elements from all these different genres and came up with this newer, faster, more extreme metal version. And that is how thrash was born. Now, where does the term thrash metal come from? Credit should go to the band Anthrax, who had a song very early on called Metal Thrashing Mad. Based on that song, a Kerrang journalist called Malcolm Dome would actually end up using that term to describe this new kind of heavy metal. Before that, bands were calling themselves heavy metal, or in some cases power metal. There's a couple of regional scenes that really stood out. First up, and this is often considered the real birth of thrash metal, we had the San Francisco Bay Area scene that would produce bands like Metallica, like Testament, Exodus, and a number of other legends. Sometimes people include Slayer and Megadeth to that scene. I don't think that's really correct, but I will explain all of that in a video on the Bay Area scene later on. On the East Coast, you also had a very influential thrash scene centered around the city of New York with bands like Anthrax and Overkill. And New York being one of the ultimate hardcore cities, the East Coast scene definitely had a more punky vibe than the West Coast scene. In Europe, Germany was really the place to be with the Teutonic thrash scene, bands like Kreator, Sodom, Destruction, and many more. And then finally, in Brazil, there was a significant scene as well. I will come back to those scenes in detail in other videos. So if you're looking for those obscure underground thrash bands, this is not gonna be that video for you. Instead, we are gonna focus on the biggest classics of the 80s. Although some purists might say that by the mid-80s, even thrash metal lost its edge as it became so popular and eventually took over the mainstream of metal, it's impossible not to acknowledge how amazing 1985, 86, and 87 were for thrash metal. A record that is contender for best thrash metal album of all time, Bonded by Blood by Exodus, came out in 1985, but 1986 really took things to a different level. Think about it. Megadeth released Peace Sells But Who's Buying, Metallica released Master of Puppets, and Slayer released Rain and Blood. And to top it all off, in 1987, Anthrax released their classic Amongst the Living. Now Megadeth, Metallica, Slayer, and Anthrax are now still considered the big four of thrash metal. So obviously they're gonna be heavily featured on this playlist. So thrash metal would really propel itself into the mainstream of metal. However, none of this lasts. Already by the end of the 80s and definitely at the start of the 90s, traditional thrash metal was losing its popularity. The biggest bands successfully adjusted their sounds to a more groove and alternative metal version. Slayer fans will tell you that Slayer never changed and Slayer stayed the same because of Slayer! I'm gonna do that again. Slayer! Alright. Because of Slayer! Don't let them fool you. Slayer also changed. Briefly. Anyone remember Diabolus in Musica? Yeah, I tried to forget about that one too. Alright, enough said. Let's explore my top picks for the essential 80s thrash metal. We're gonna keep this countdown in chronological order with two exceptions. The first and the last song. I just like to kick off playlists with an epic opening song. And what better song to open this playlist with in an epic way with the first song from the Master of Puppets album. This is Metallica with Battery. Battery is still a fan favorite, and I really love how it opens the Master of Puppets album. It's just this menacing, creeping song that comes at you and then just explodes. On the concept of exploding, let's keep accelerating with Anthrax, Gung-ho. With some of my closest metalheads, I keep arguing about Megadeth. I find it's one of those bands where people have very strong opinions and people have very different favorite songs. One of my favorite songs is one of their earlier classics, Rattlehead. Well, here I So I called out Exodus earlier, and some would say that Exodus is the 5th band in the Big 5, but then what do you do with Testament, and what do you do with Overkill, and so on and so on. Exodus is an amazing thrash metal band. Probably no band captures the Bay Area spirit as well as Exodus does, and definitely on this song from their Bonded by Blood classic, Piranha. Experienced metalheads obviously know how Exodus's history has been intertwined with a number of big thrash icons. Kirk Hammett, guitar player of Metallica, was with Exodus before he joined Metallica, and in more recent years, both Gary Holt and Paul Bostaph have played with Slayer. Alright, let's keep it going with ultimate classics. How about Dark Angel with Darkness Descends? Although this list is predominantly American bands, we cannot forget some other bands like the German Kreator. Flag of Hate is definitely one of the ultimate classics from Kreator. It's not necessarily my favorite Kreator song. Kreator has released so many good albums over so many years, but from their 80s period, this is definitely a classic, and they will still play that live every show. Anyway, time for another band from the Big Four, and probably the most famous scream in metal. Okay. Ozzy's Scream in Black Sabbath and Bruce Dickinson's Scream in Number of the Beast are pretty iconic too, but I would say that Angel of Death has a special place. Slayer together with Megadeth, the biggest band coming out of Los Angeles, not really considered Bay Area thrash for that reason, but man, Rain in Blood is such a classic. I think it's hard to argue that this album would not be the biggest thrash album of all time, and it's amazing also how short it is. The entire album is less than 29 minutes. Fun fact, when they were sending out promo copies on cassette back in the day, they would just put the entire album on the A side and the entire album on the B side. Alright, let's stay with the Big Four. One of my favorite songs of the Peace Sells album by Megadeth, My Last Words. If you've ever been to an Anthrax show, you know that there's a certain gimmick that the band will always use, and that is in the middle of this next song to stop everybody to check whether or not the audience is having a good enough time. At which point they remind people that this is the war dance and that you have to go completely crazy. It's a silly gimmick, but it works. At number 9, Indians by Anthrax. So finally, we've come to this other band that is always in the running with Exodus to be considered the 5th band in the Big 5. This is Testament with Into the Pit. One of my favorite bands from the East Coast scene was always a little bit different. I'm talking about Sacred Reich with Surf Nicaragua. Now it's too late, you're entering Managua. You're by yourself, I need to surf Nicaragua. Alright, back to probably the biggest metal band of all time, Metallica. I'm gonna be doing several videos on Metallica just themselves, but when I have to think about what is one of my favorite thrash anthems of the 80s, maybe a more unexpected choice, but I would definitely go with Dyers Eve from the And Justice for All record. Dear mother, what is this tale you have put me through? Believer, deceiver, day in, day out, live my life through you. Going back to a band that might not be as known today anymore as the Big Four, but they were definitely a pioneer, Nuclear Assault with Critical Mass. Now, let's go to Canada, where guitar mastermind Jeff Waters had his band Annihilator. This is Alison Hell. You are looking blue. What else can you do? Alright, let's go back to the East Coast scene. One of my favorite thrash bands of all time, still today, Overkill with Elimination. We had to go back to Testament. I mean, Testament is a fantastic band and they are still producing some of their best work today, but that is for another video. At number 16, one of their biggest classics, Practice What You Preach. Okay, I already gave away that the last song was not gonna be chronologically correct necessarily, but can we end this playlist with any other song than the epic Raining Blood? Alright, those were my picks for the most essential 80s thrash songs. No worries, there's gonna be multiple videos on all the different scenes of thrash metal in the 80s. So the songs that you were missing will probably show up in those other videos. But hey, let me know in the comments which songs you wanted to see in this list. Hey, thank you so much for watching that countdown video. If you like this video, click right here to see more content like it and subscribe to the channel.